In the heart of a harsh winter, a mother's love knows no bounds. Max, a once proud rescue dog, now fights for her life and her puppies. Betrayed, abandoned, and tied to a railway track, her fate seems sealed. But what brought her here? And who will save them in their darkest hour? This is the story of courage, loyalty, and a love that refuses to give up. The crisp winter air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of a frozen breeze. Max, a German shepherd with a proud stance once marked by the badge of a K9 rescue unit, now carried the weight of her past on scarred paws. Her body bore the marks of countless missions, but her spirit was unbroken as she trudged through the snow, her 3 puppies following closely behind. Each step was a fight against exhaustion and the biting cold, yet Max pushed forward, driven by the instinct to protect her young and a distant hope of finding her former handler. As the night deepened, hunger gnawed at their bellies. Max's sharp nose caught the faint scent of food, pulling her attention to a snow-covered yard near an abandoned house. She hesitated, her keen instincts warning her to be cautious, but desperation urged her forward. The puppies whimpered softly behind her, their tiny bodies trembling from the cold and hunger. The scent led her to a discarded piece of meat lying carelessly near the steps of the dilapidated house. Max scanned her surroundings, her ears swiveling for any sign of danger. Satisfied that no immediate threat was present, she stepped forward, her movements precise and careful. Gripping the meat in her teeth, she turned back toward her puppies, her tail swishing with relief. The meal wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going for another day. Unbeknownst to her, she was being watched. From the shadows emerged a man, his steps uneven and his breath clouding in the frigid air. His face was flushed and his clothes reeked of alcohol. He had seen Max take the meat, and anger twisted his expression into one of malice. "Thieving dog," he slurred, staggering closer. Max froze, her body tensing as she locked eyes with the man. Her protective instincts flared, and she growled softly, stepping in front of her puppies. The man laughed harshly, his voice laced with cruelty. "You think you can just take from me and walk away?" Max's growl deepened, her posture defensive. She knew she couldn't risk a fight with her puppies so close, so she began to back away slowly, her eyes never leaving the man. But he was faster. Lurching forward, he grabbed a length of rope from the ground and swung it wildly. Max barked sharply, urging her puppies to scatter, but their small legs couldn't carry them far. The man's drunken rage gave him strength as he cornered Max and her puppies. With a cruel grin, he looped the rope around her neck and tied her tightly, ignoring her frantic struggles. The puppies cried out, their tiny voices pleading as he gathered them and bound them beside their mother. "You'll learn not to steal," he muttered, his breath heavy with alcohol. Dragging them roughly, he hauled the family toward the train tracks that ran through the edge of the yard. The steel rails gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a cold and merciless path through the snow. Max twisted and pulled against the rope, her growls turning to yelps as the bindings cut into her skin. The man tied her and her puppies firmly to the tracks, his crude laughter echoing in the stillness. "Let's see how tough you are now," he sneered, before staggering away, leaving them to their fate. The puppies whimpered, pressing close to Max as she struggled against the rope. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but the bindings were too tight. The cold steel of the tracks beneath her paws felt unforgiving, and the faint sound of a train in the distance sent a jolt of fear through her. She nudged her puppies gently, licking their faces in an attempt to calm them, her eyes scanning the darkness for a miracle. The distant rumble of the train grew louder, its approach marked by the faint tremors in the ground. Max stilled, her breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. Her body ached, and her scarred leg throbbed with pain, but she refused to give up. Lowering herself protectively over her puppies, she braced herself against the cold metal, her body shielding them from the oncoming danger. Her eyes glimmered with a mix of fear and resolve. If this was to be their end, Max would face it with unwavering courage, protecting her young until her last breath. The train's horn pierced the night, its blaring cry a cruel reminder of the fleeting moments she had left. The night was eerily silent, the kind of stillness that makes every sound more pronounced. Ethan, a retired railway worker in his late 50s, walked along the familiar paths near the tracks, as he did every evening. The cold air bit at his cheeks, and his breath formed soft clouds with every exhale. His flashlight illuminated patches of snow-covered ground, casting long shadows from the surrounding trees. Ethan had lived alone for years. The solitude was a constant companion since the loss of his wife Mary 5 years ago. The rhythmic hum of trains used to comfort him, a reminder of simpler times when life was full of purpose. But tonight, something felt different. As he approached a bend near the tracks, a faint, distressed sound reached his ears, a bark, weak and pleading. Ethan stopped, his brows furrowing as he strained to listen. There it was again, followed by faint whimpers. His heart quickened. The sound wasn't far, but it was overpowered by the distant rumble of an oncoming train. Without hesitation, Ethan turned toward the noise, his flashlight cutting through the dark. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. There, bound to the railway lines, was a German shepherd with 3 tiny puppies huddled beneath her. The dog's body shielded them, her frame tense and protective, despite the obvious struggle she had endured. Her eyes glimmered in the beam of his flashlight, locking onto his with a silent plea. The train's headlights loomed in the distance, the horn blaring a warning that time was running out. "Oh my God," Ethan muttered, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't waste a second. Dropping his flashlight, he sprinted toward the scene, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The vibrations from the approaching train intensified with each step, shaking the earth beneath him. "Hang on, girl, I'm coming!" Ethan shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the growing roar of the train. The German shepherd didn't move, her body a steadfast barrier between her puppies and the oncoming danger. Ethan's stomach churned at the sight. How could anyone do this to an innocent creature? Reaching the tracks, Ethan dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he worked to free the puppies first. The train's horn blared louder, a deafening scream that sent adrenaline surging through his veins. The first knot came loose, then the second. The puppies whimpered as Ethan scooped them up, cradling their tiny bodies against his chest. "Just hold on!" he yelled to the mother dog, whose gaze remained fixed on her young. Ethan dashed to the side of the tracks, placing the puppies safely in the snow before rushing back for her. The train was almost upon them now, its headlights a blinding force cutting through the dark. Ethan fumbled with the rope that bound her, his hands stiff from the cold and shaking with urgency. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, his heart pounding in his chest. With a final tug, the rope came loose. Ethan pulled her with all his strength, but the momentum of the train was too close. As he yanked her away, a piece of debris from the train struck her hind leg, sending them both tumbling into the snowbank beside the tracks. The train thundered past, its deafening roar fading into the distance. Ethan lay on his back, panting heavily, the cold snow biting through his coat. Beside him, the German shepherd struggled to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion. Blood seeped from a deep gash on her hind leg, staining the pristine snow a vivid crimson. She let out a low whimper, but limped immediately toward her puppies, who were shivering in the snow. Ethan sat up, his chest heaving as he watched the reunion. The mother dog nosed her pups, licking them gently as they pressed close to her for warmth. His heart clenched at the sight. Despite her injury, her first thought was for her young. "You're one tough girl," Ethan said softly, crawling closer. He extended a hand cautiously, not wanting to startle her. The German shepherd froze, her body tense, but her eyes held no aggression, only exhaustion and gratitude. She allowed him to place a gentle hand on her head, her ears flicking slightly at his touch. "You can't stay out here," Ethan murmured. He glanced at her leg, noting the severity of the wound. "You need help, and fast." Removing his flannel jacket, Ethan carefully wrapped it around the mother dog and her puppies, creating a makeshift bundle. The dog whimpered but didn't resist, as if understanding that he meant no harm. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he said, his voice filled with determination. Carrying the fragile family in his arms, Ethan trudged back toward his small house at the edge of town. The walk was slow, each step careful to avoid jarring the injured dog. The puppies nestled against their mother, their tiny breaths warm against Ethan's chest. Despite the cold and the weight of his burden, Ethan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. As his house came into view, illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light, Ethan quickened his pace. He gently placed the bundle on the porch, unlocking the door with trembling fingers. Inside, the warmth from the wood stove enveloped them, melting the chill from the night. Ethan laid the mother dog and her puppies on an old blanket near the fire. The room was quiet, except for the crackling of the flames and the soft whimpers of the puppies. Grabbing his first aid kit, Ethan knelt beside the dog. "This is going to sting a bit," he warned softly, cleaning the gash on her leg. She flinched, but didn't growl or snap, her trust in him evident despite her pain. "You're safe now," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He glanced at the puppies, who had fallen asleep, nestled against their mother's side. "I'll take care of all of you." As the night deepened, Ethan sat back in his chair, watching the small family rest. For the first time in years, the quiet house felt alive again. The mother dog, now relaxed, gave Ethan a grateful glance before closing her eyes. Though her journey had brought her to the brink of disaster, she had found a protector in Ethan, a man who, in saving her, had found a renewed sense of purpose. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, for her and for her pups. The morning sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows of Ethan's modest home in Redwood, a small, peaceful town tucked away amidst rolling hills and towering pines. Inside, the crackling warmth of the wood stove filled the room, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Max lay on a thick blanket near the fire, her puppies curled up beside her in a tangle of soft fur. Their rhythmic breaths rose and fell, the first signs of peace after days of hardship. Ethan sat in his worn armchair, sipping a steaming mug of coffee. His gaze drifted to Max, who lifted her head slightly at his movement. Her dark eyes, intelligent yet shadowed, met his. There was a depth in her expression, a mix of gratitude, wariness, and something else he couldn't quite place. It was the look of someone who had seen too much and lost even more. "You're a strong one, aren't you?" Ethan said softly, setting his mug down and leaning forward. Max's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but she remained still, watching him with quiet curiosity. He noticed the faint scars on her legs and the stiffness in her movements, signs of a life that had demanded far more than it should from her. Over the following days, Ethan dedicated himself to caring for Max and her puppies. The little ones grew stronger with each passing hour, their energy returning in bursts of playful curiosity. Ethan couldn't help but smile as they tumbled over each other on the living room floor, their tiny tails wagging furiously. Max, however, was different. While her body healed under Ethan's careful attention, her injured leg bandaged and cleaned daily, her spirit remained heavy. She often stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though searching for something or someone. Ethan noticed how she seemed to relax around the puppies, but grew restless when left alone, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to walk through the door. One afternoon, as Ethan was chopping wood outside, he noticed Max watching him from the porch. She had started venturing further from her blanket, but always kept the puppies in sight. Her movements, though cautious, revealed something Ethan couldn't ignore: discipline. She moved with precision, her posture balanced, and her responses to his commands were immediate, even though he hadn't taught her anything. Curious, Ethan decided to test his theory. Inside the house, he knelt down, holding a small treat. "Max, sit," he said, his tone firm but kind. To his surprise, Max immediately sat, her ears perked up and eyes focused on him. Ethan furrowed his brow. "Stay," he said next, stepping back a few paces. Max didn't move, her gaze locked on him, waiting for his next instruction. "Good girl," he murmured, tossing her the treat. She caught it mid-air, her movements smooth and practiced. Ethan sat back on his heels, his mind racing. This wasn't the behavior of a stray dog. Max had been trained exceptionally well. Ethan spent the evening researching everything he could about canine rescue dogs. He rummaged through his bookshelf, pulling out an old guide to working dogs he had picked up years ago. As he read, he began to piece together Max's story: her discipline, her ability to follow commands, and even her unwavering loyalty to her puppies. It all pointed to a past where she had served a purpose far greater than surviving day to day. That night, as the puppies slept soundly beside her, Ethan sat by the fire, studying Max with newfound curiosity. "You were someone's partner, weren't you?" he asked quietly. Max's ears twitched at his voice, and she turned her head to look at him. Her eyes, filled with both longing and sorrow, seemed to answer his question. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to his own past. He knew what it was like to lose someone who had been your whole world. His wife Mary had been his anchor, and losing her had left him adrift. He couldn't imagine what Max must have felt, torn away from her handler, her partner, without any way of knowing if they were alive or waiting for her somewhere. The next morning, Ethan decided to dig deeper. He called the local animal shelter and described Max, hoping to find clues about her past. The woman on the other end of the line listened carefully before responding. "She might have been part of a rescue program. There's a K9 training facility about 50 miles from here. They might have records." Ethan thanked her and hung up, his resolve solidifying. Max deserved answers, and he was determined to help her find them. For now, though, he focused on giving her the care she needed. He spent hours each day playing with the puppies, helping them grow stronger, while ensuring Max felt safe and loved. Over time, Max began to relax in his presence. She started following him around the house, her trust growing slowly but steadily. When Ethan worked on small repairs or sat on the porch with his coffee, Max would rest by his feet, her gaze ever watchful. Yet, even in these moments of calm, Ethan could see the flicker of longing in her eyes, a yearning for a part of her life that had been left behind. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan couldn't ignore the bond forming between them. Max was no longer just a stray he had rescued. She had become part of his life. Watching her interact with the puppies, her gentle care and unwavering vigilance, he saw a reflection of her past strength. But more than that, he saw her resilience, her ability to keep moving forward despite the scars she carried. One evening, as the fire crackled softly and the puppies played near the warmth, Ethan placed a hand on Max's head. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "We'll figure this out, girl," he whispered. "We'll find where you came from, and we'll make sure you're never alone again." Max opened her eyes, meeting Ethan's gaze with an expression of quiet gratitude. In that moment, Ethan realized that while he was helping Max heal, she was doing the same for him. Her presence had brought life back into his quiet home, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose. Together, they were finding a way to move beyond their scars, one step at a time. The winter sun cast long shadows over the quiet town of Redwood as Ethan sat at his kitchen table, an old notebook open before him. Pages filled with names, scribbled notes and underlined places reflected his growing determination to uncover the truth about Max. He had spent weeks watching her, studying her behavior, and piecing together fragments of her story. Now, it was time to act. Max lay nearby, her puppies tumbling over one another on the blanket. Though her leg had healed well under Ethan's care, her gaze often drifted to the horizon, as if searching for something, or someone. That distant look fueled Ethan's resolve. Max deserved answers, and so did he. Ethan began his search by visiting the local diner, a hub for Redwood's tight-knit community. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the warmth of the room a welcome contrast to the cold outside. Maggie, the diner's owner, greeted him with a smile. "Morning, Ethan. Coffee?" she asked, pouring him a cup before he even sat down. "Thanks, Maggie," Ethan replied, taking a seat at the counter. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a Polaroid of Max and her puppies, sliding it across the counter. "Have you seen this dog before?" Maggie picked up the photo, her brow furrowing in thought. "She looks familiar," she said slowly. "I think I've seen her near the old Carter farm a few times. No one's lived there in years, though. The place is falling apart." Ethan nodded, jotting down the location in his notebook. Before he could thank her, an older man sitting in a corner booth spoke up. "That dog," he said, his voice rough but steady, "used to be one of them rescue dogs, didn't she? I remember hearing about her on the news a while back. Got lost during some big disaster over in the next county." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of disaster?" he asked, leaning toward the man. "Flood," the man replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Hit the whole area hard. They said a few K9 dogs went missing during the evacuations. Most of them got found, but some didn't." Ethan's mind raced as the pieces began to fit together. Max wasn't just a stray. She had been part of something much larger, a hero lost in the chaos of disaster. He left the diner with a newfound determination, his next stop clear. The library was quiet, its rows of books and archives bathed in soft fluorescent light. Mrs. Whitman, the elderly librarian who had lived in Redwood her entire life, greeted Ethan warmly. "What brings you in today, Ethan?" she asked, her kind eyes curious. "I'm trying to learn more about a K9 rescue program," Ethan explained, showing her Max's photo. "I think she might have been part of it." Mrs. Whitman's expression grew serious as she led him to a back room filled with newspaper archives. "There was a lot of coverage about the flood and the rescue efforts," she said, pulling out a stack of yellowed clippings. "Let's see what we can find." Ethan spent hours sifting through the articles, his fingers tracing headlines like "K9 Heroes Save Lives in Flooded Town" and "Missing Dogs from Rescue Team Spark Search Efforts." One article caught his attention. It featured a photo of a group of K9 dogs with their handlers, their vests emblazoned with the words "Search and Rescue." Ethan's eyes scanned the image until they landed on a familiar face, Max. Her handler stood beside her, a young man with a confident smile and a firm grip on her leash. The caption read, "Max and handler Tyler Grayson, heroes of the rescue effort." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind flooded with questions. Who was Tyler? What had happened to separate him from Max? And why had no one come looking for her? As Mrs. Whitman packed up the archives, she handed Ethan a folded piece of paper. "This came in with some donations last year," she said. "It's a letter from someone who worked with the rescue dogs during that time. It might help." Ethan opened the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "To whoever finds this, I'm sorry for what happened to those dogs. The flood was chaos and we couldn't save them all. Some went missing and we couldn't track them down. If you find one, please give them the love they deserve. They gave everything for us." The words weighed heavily on Ethan as he tucked the letter into his pocket. Max had been through more than he could have imagined, and it was time to dig deeper. That evening, Ethan sat by the fire, the letter in one hand and the newspaper photo in the other. He glanced at Max, who was resting with her puppies. She looked peaceful, but the faint scars on her body and the distant look in her eyes told a story of resilience and pain. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Ethan murmured, his voice soft. "But you didn't give up, and I won't either." The next morning, Ethan made a call to the K9 training facility mentioned in the article. After explaining the situation and describing Max, the woman on the other end confirmed that Max had been one of their most skilled rescue dogs. She had been reported missing during the flood, and her handler, Tyler Grayson, had searched for her tirelessly before being reassigned to another unit. "He never stopped asking about her," the woman said. "Max was his partner. If he knew she was alive—" Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you have a way to contact him?" "I'll reach out to him and let him know. Thank you for finding her." After hanging up, Ethan felt a mix of relief and anticipation. Max's journey wasn't over, but at least now there was hope. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Ethan sat beside Max and gently stroked her fur. "We're going to figure this out, girl," he said. "We'll find your partner. You've got someone out there who loves you, and I'm going to help you get back to him." Max tilted her head, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, there was a glimmer of something new, trust, and perhaps even hope. Ethan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together they would face it, one step at a time. The frosty morning sun barely warmed the air as Ethan guided his old pickup truck down the winding roads of Redwood, heading toward the nearby animal shelter. The shelter, known as Northern Haven Rescue, had a reputation for taking in the forgotten and abandoned, offering them a second chance. Ethan hoped it would hold answers about Max's missing years, the time between her disappearance during the flood and their fateful meeting on the tracks. Max sat in the passenger seat, her sharp eyes watching the passing scenery. Her 3 puppies, now more energetic and curious, played softly in the crate, lined with blankets in the back seat. Ethan occasionally glanced at Max, noticing how her ears twitched at every sound, her posture alert yet calm. There was a quiet strength about her, a testament to everything she had endured. Arriving at the shelter, Ethan was greeted by a kind-faced woman named Claire, the manager of Northern Haven Rescue. "You must be Ethan," she said, extending a hand. "I heard about Max from the K9 facility. She's remarkable." Her gaze shifted to Max, who was now standing protectively near Ethan, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment. "She's been through a lot," Ethan replied. "I was hoping you might help fill in the gaps." Claire nodded, leading them inside. The shelter was modest but well-maintained, with clean kennels and the faint sounds of barking and purring echoing through the halls. Ethan took a seat while Max sat by his side, her gaze steady and unflinching. Claire returned with a folder, flipping through its contents. "We don't have detailed records for every stray that comes through, but I do remember her. She arrived here about a year after the flood, severely underweight and injured. She had no identification, but her training was obvious. We assumed she was a lost K9 or a service dog." Ethan frowned. "And the puppies?" Claire's expression softened, her fingers tracing a line in the notes. "She didn't arrive with them. The puppies came later, born after she was released back into the wild." Ethan's stomach turned. "Released? Why?" Claire sighed. "The shelter was overwhelmed at the time. We were dealing with dozens of animals from nearby areas hit by storms. Max wasn't aggressive, but she was highly anxious. She escaped during transport to a foster home and disappeared. We assumed the worst." Ethan looked down at Max, who lay quietly at his feet, her ears perking up slightly, as if sensing the conversation was about her. "So she survived on her own." "She did," Claire confirmed. "When animals like her escape, their instincts kick in, but it's a hard life. The fact that she managed to stay alive long enough to have and protect her puppies is nothing short of a miracle." Ethan's mind raced, piecing together Max's journey. After losing her handler, she had been left to fend for herself in a world that had offered her little kindness. Yet, she had fought for survival, not just for herself, but for her young. "Do you know anything else?" Ethan asked. Claire hesitated before pulling out a worn photograph. It showed Max, thinner and more battered than she was now, lying in a makeshift shelter. Her eyes, even in the faded image, carried the same determination Ethan saw in her every day. "This was taken by one of our volunteers before she escaped. She must have wandered far from here to end up on the tracks." Ethan studied the photo, his chest tightening. "Thank you, Claire," he said quietly, tucking the picture into his jacket. "You've helped more than you know." On the drive back, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Max in the photo. It was one thing to imagine her struggle. It was another to see the evidence of it. He glanced at her now, healthier and stronger, her pups dozing peacefully in the back. She had come so far, yet the scars of her journey lingered. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan set the puppies down near the fire, watching as they stretched and tumbled over one another. Max, as always, stayed close, her watchful eyes scanning the room. Ethan sat down across from her, the photograph in hand. "You've been through more than I can imagine," he said softly. "But you never gave up, did you?" Max tilted her head at the sound of his voice, her ears perking up slightly. Ethan leaned back, his thoughts drifting. The stories of her resilience, the hardships she endured, painted a picture of a life filled with struggle, but also unwavering hope. She had survived not just for herself, but for her puppies, refusing to let the world's cruelty extinguish her spirit. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the sounds of the puppies' soft snores filled the room. His thoughts returned to Max's handler, Tyler Grayson. Did he know how far Max had come? Did he still hope to find her? Ethan resolved to find out. Max's story wasn't just one of survival, it was one of connection, and Ethan was determined to help her find the closure she deserved. Max, lying near the fireplace, lifted her head and glanced at Ethan as if sensing his thoughts. Her eyes, filled with quiet strength, reminded him of why he couldn't stop now. Together, they would uncover the rest of her story, no matter how painful the memories might be. The days grew longer as winter began its slow retreat, the snow around Ethan's farmhouse melting into patches of green. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove kept the chill at bay, but the true source of life and energy in the house was the small family of German shepherds that now called it home. Max had found her rhythm here, though the weight of her past still lingered in her steady, watchful eyes. Ethan couldn't help but admire her strength. Each morning, Max would rise before the puppies, carefully nudging them awake and guiding them through the routines she seemed to establish on instinct. She monitored their play, disciplined them when needed, and ensured they never strayed too far. To Ethan, it was as if she was still a K9 in some way, training and protecting her charges as she had been trained to do. Ethan, for his part, made it his mission to earn Max's trust fully. Though she no longer flinched at his touch and often lay beside him near the fire, there were moments when her gaze turned distant, her ears pricking up at every unexpected sound. It was in those moments that Ethan saw her heart was still tethered to the past, yearning for the handler she had once served. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch with a mug of coffee in hand, Max joined him, her frame settling quietly at his feet. The puppies, now larger and bolder, chased each other around the yard, their playful barks filling the crisp air. Ethan reached down to stroke Max's fur, his touch gentle and reassuring. "You've got nothing to worry about here," he murmured, his voice soft. "You're safe, Max, and I'll make sure it stays that way." Max tilted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, Ethan saw something shift, an acknowledgement, perhaps, or even gratitude. She lowered her head to rest it on his foot, a gesture so subtle yet profound that it left Ethan with a lump in his throat. The puppies, meanwhile, were thriving. Each day they grew more curious and playful, exploring the nooks and crannies of the farmhouse with boundless energy. Ethan had named them based on their personalities. The boldest pup, always eager to lead the charge, he called Scout. The smallest, who often lingered near Max for comfort, became Milo. The third, a mischievous one with a penchant for chewing on Ethan's boots, earned the name Rosie. The trio brought a new kind of energy to the farmhouse, one that Ethan hadn't realized he needed. Their playful antics and clumsy adventures filled the quiet spaces with laughter and joy. Max, though watchful, seemed to relax more in their presence, as if reassured by their liveliness. Ethan made it a point to include Max in every aspect of their lives. Whether it was fixing the fence outside, preparing meals, or simply sitting by the fire at night, Max was never far from his side. Slowly but surely, the bond between them deepened, built on mutual respect and the shared understanding of what it meant to survive loss. One afternoon, Ethan worked in the yard, repairing a broken section of the fence. Max sat nearby, her eyes trained on the puppies as they darted between the trees at the edge of the property. Occasionally, she would bark softly, her voice firm yet gentle, calling them back when they ventured too far. Ethan paused to watch her, leaning on his hammer. "You're doing a better job keeping them in line than I ever could," he chuckled. Max glanced at him, her ears perking up slightly, before returning her attention to the puppies. Ethan couldn't help but smile. She had a way of commanding attention without force, a testament to her disciplined past and nurturing instincts. As the sun began to set, Ethan called the puppies inside, their tiny forms bounding up the steps with tails wagging furiously. Max followed close behind, her gait steady despite the faint limp in her healed leg. Inside, Ethan had set up a cozy corner with blankets and toys where the puppies quickly settled down. Max lay beside them, her body relaxed for the first time in what felt like years. Ethan sat in his armchair, the warmth of the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. He watched as Max gently licked Milo's head, her movements slow and deliberate. The scene filled him with a quiet sense of peace. His home, once a place of solitude and grief, now felt alive again. Over the following weeks, the bond between Ethan and Max continued to grow. She began following him everywhere, whether he was working in the yard, fixing something in the house, or simply enjoying a quiet moment on the porch. Her trust in him deepened, and Ethan noticed her distant, searching looks becoming less frequent. She was still tethered to her past, but now she seemed to accept the present as a place of safety. One night, as the puppies slept soundly near the fire, Ethan sat beside Max, running his hand through her fur. "You've got a heart of gold, Max," he said quietly. "You've been through so much, but you never gave up. That's something special." Max lifted her head, her gaze meeting his. In her eyes, Ethan saw a mixture of gratitude and understanding. She leaned into his touch, letting out a soft sigh. For the first time since she had arrived, Max seemed to fully relax, her body sinking into the comfort of the moment. The days fell into a comforting rhythm, each one bringing Ethan and Max closer together. The puppies grew stronger and more independent, their playful barks echoing through the farmhouse. Max, though still watchful, began to let her guard down. She no longer flinched at sudden sounds, and her posture was less rigid, her movements more fluid and confident. For Ethan, Max had become more than just a dog. She was a partner, a symbol of resilience and hope. She reminded him that even in the face of loss and hardship, it was possible to find new beginnings. Together, they were healing, their shared moments weaving a bond that neither time nor distance could break. As the sun set on another day, Ethan stood on the porch, watching the puppies play in the yard. Max sat beside him, her head resting on his knee, her eyes calm and content. The faint scars on her body were still visible, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they stood as a testament to her strength, a reminder that she had faced the worst and emerged with her heart intact. Ethan looked down at her, a soft smile on his face. "We've come a long way, haven't we, girl?" Max's ears perked up at his voice, and she gave a gentle wag of her tail. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the evening, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Spring arrived quietly in Redwood, bringing with it the promise of renewal. The last traces of snow had melted away, revealing a lush green landscape dotted with wildflowers. Ethan's farmhouse, once a quiet and solitary place, now bustled with life. The sound of paws on wooden floors and playful barks filled the air, blending seamlessly with the songs of birds outside. Max had settled into her new life with grace. Her once guarded posture had softened, and her eyes, which had always carried the weight of her past, now reflected a quiet peace. She spent her days caring for her 3 rambunctious puppies, who had grown strong and full of life under Ethan's watchful care. One crisp morning, Ethan sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The puppies tumbled in the yard, chasing one another with unbridled energy. Max lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, her gaze following her young with a mixture of pride and contentment. "You've done a good job, Max," Ethan said, glancing down at her. "They're lucky to have a mom like you." Max's ears perked up, and she tilted her head slightly, her tail thumping against the porch. Ethan chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind her ears. It was a simple moment, but one that spoke volumes about how far they had come together. In the weeks that followed, the bond between Ethan and Max deepened further. She became his constant companion, following him as he worked in the yard or repaired the old barn. Her trust in him was now absolute, and Ethan found himself leaning on her presence as a source of comfort and purpose. The puppies, now named Scout, Milo, and Rosie, had become the heart of the household. They brought laughter and light into Ethan's life, reminding him of the joy he hadn't felt in years. Each one had a distinct personality: Scout, the bold leader; Milo, the gentle soul; and Rosie, the mischievous troublemaker. Together, they filled the house with a warmth that had been missing for far too long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan sat on the porch with Max by his side. The puppies lay curled up on a blanket near the steps, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each sleepy breath. Ethan looked out at the peaceful scene before him, his heart full. "You know," he said softly, glancing at Max, "I thought I was rescuing you that night. But the truth is, you rescued me too." Max lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting his. In that moment, it was as if she understood every word. She leaned into his touch, her tail wagging slowly. Though the search for Max's former handler, Tyler Grayson, had led to a dead end, Ethan no longer saw it as a failure. Max had found her way to where she was meant to be, and in doing so, she had built a new life, not just for herself but for Ethan as well. The scars of the past, both hers and his, remained, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they served as reminders of the strength it took to move forward and the beauty of second chances. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Ethan leaned back in his chair, a sense of contentment washing over him. Max stretched out beside him, her body relaxed, her eyes half closed in a state of utter peace. The puppies let out soft whimpers in their sleep, their dreams undisturbed. The farmhouse, once a place of solitude and grief, was now a home filled with love, laughter, and hope. Ethan reached down to stroke Max's fur, his voice soft but resolute. "This is our new beginning, girl, and I promise you, you'll never have to face anything alone again." Max let out a contented sigh, her eyes glowing with trust and happiness. For the first time in years, she felt whole. She had found her family, her purpose, and her peace, and as she lay beside Ethan, her heart full, she knew this was where she was meant to be. The fireflies began to dance in the cool evening air, their gentle glow illuminating the porch. The world outside faded into the background, leaving only the warmth of the moment, the start of a beautiful, hopeful chapter for Ethan, Max, and her puppies.